Welcome to the deep dive. You're here because you want to get a real handle on these big, complex issues, right? Without getting totally lost in the weeds. We get it.
Yeah, totally.
So today, we're really going to focus on climate change. We're taking a hard look at how Western climate policies are, well, playing out on the ground.
Hmm?
And then we're going to compare that to what's happening with the world's biggest emitters, China and India.
Exactly. The goal today is really to understand the social and economic pressures these policies are creating, in Europe, the U.S.,
Right.
and then ask, okay, are these efforts being matched? Or maybe are they being kind of undermined by what China and India are doing?
Yeah, is one hand sort of canceling out the other?
Basically,
Hmm.
we need to look at the latest emissions data, their policy commitments, just get a much clearer, fact-based view of the whole global picture.
Okay. And we've pulled together, what, a bunch of recent reports and analyses,
Hmm.
all from the last couple of years, like 2023 to 2025.
That's right. Stuff looking at the policies, the emissions trends, and, the real-world impacts on people, on their jobs, their wallets.
All right, let's unpack this then. It feels like, well, we hear constantly about going green in developed countries, right? But there's this undercurrent of worry that maybe these aggressive measures are starting to pinch.
Oh, definitely. People are feeling it. And the data actually supports that feeling pretty
Sure.
strongly.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that European Commission survey. It found, what was it, 62% of Europeans expect their purchasing power to fall because of the green transition.
Wow, 62%. That's significant.
It is. And a quarter are worried about losing their jobs as industries shift. And that jumps to nearly half, 44% among young adults.
Almost half. That really says something about the fairness of how this is rolling out, doesn't it?
It raises huge questions about social equity, for sure. And it's not just Europe. You see a similar, maybe even sharper divide in the U.S.
Right, along political lines, I saw that stat like 56% of Republicans think climate policies are hurting the economy, while 52% of Democrats think they're helping. It's just become so polarized.
Completely. And, you can understand why. When people are worried about inflation, the cost of living right now,
Yeah.
longer-term climate goals can feel a bit abstract, maybe.
Yeah, the immediate pressure wins out, and that ties into these household costs, right? Things like fuel taxes, carbon levies.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Because while the idea is to discourage emissions, these policies can hit lower-income households hardest. They're regressive, often.
Like the yellow vests in France, that was huge.
A perfect example.
Right.
That fuel tax hike sparked massive protests. And Macron, well, he had to adjust course, didn't he? Shows how politically sensitive this stuff is.
It really does. And we're seeing similar debates elsewhere, like London's EULA's expansion.
The ultra-low emission zone.
Or those proposals for mandatory home heating upgrades in the UK, heat pumps and all that.
Yeah, I saw commentary warning about that. The sheer cost, the disruption for homeowners. Some worry it could even lead to higher energy bills for many families initially.
That's a really tough sell.
It is. And it connects to the jobs issue, too. Shifting away from fossil fuels, well, it means some industries shrink. And history isn't always encouraging there.
You mean like the coal mine closures, that UK study from the 80s?
Exactly. It's pretty sobering stuff. They found an 80 to 90% drop in earnings in the first year for miners who lost their jobs.
80 to 90%.
Yeah. And even the ones who found new work were earning like 40% less on average.
Just devastating for those communities. And the OECD is projecting, what was it, potentially 154,000 coal jobs lost in Europe by 2030.
If the transition isn't managed really carefully,
Yeah.
it highlights how dependent many regions still are on those fossil fuel jobs. The economic stress from layoffs is immense.
It's not just a job, it's the whole community fabric.
Precisely. And then there are the infrastructure hurdles. We want everyone driving EVs, right?
Where do they charge them?
Exactly. That European survey, again, 40% of current EV owners find public charging inadequate.
40%, that's a lot.
And only about 10% think the existing setup can handle future demand.
Okay, that's concerning.
It is. And it's not just EVs. Think about installing millions of heat pumps really fast. Do we have enough trained installers? Will the supply chain keep...
Market bottlenecks.
Yeah. And consumers worry about practical things like EV range anxiety or just the sheer hassle and cost of major home upgrades.
It's that gap, isn't it, between the green vision and the messy reality of making it happen,
Politicians are definitely noticing that gap, that difference in convenience and burden.
which fuels the public backlash we're seeing. Climate policy is now a major election battleground.
For sure. Populists are definitely exploiting these anxieties. You hear Trump claiming EV mandates mean, quote, unemployment and inflation without end.
Wow. And Salvini in Italy calling the EU petrol car ban job-destroying madness.
Right. Strong language, but it clearly resonates with people feeling squeezed.
And you can see governments reacting, can't you? Like the UK government postponing the petrol car ban deadline.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak did that. And Macron in France, pairing green plans with direct cash support.
Trying to soften the blow.
Exactly. Even German leaders raising concerns about the significant economic costs of some EU rules. They're aware of the potential fallout.
That warning I read about a possible political storm bigger than ULEZ if climate action feels unfair. It rings true.
It does. So the key takeaway here seems to be widespread concerns about cost, jobs, fairness. They're creating real social strain, maybe eroding trust.
Which explains why governments are turning to things like subsidies, more phased approaches, like the big Inflation Reduction Act in the US, trying to manage the transition.
Right. But now
Yeah.
we have to shift focus because while the West is wrestling with all this, what's happening with the really big emitters, China and India?
Yeah, the other side of the coin.
And this is where the global picture gets really, really complex because emissions in Europe and the U.S. are generally trending down.
Okay.
China and India, their emissions are still seeing significant increases. Together, they're responsible for roughly half of all global co-eros. China alone is about 35%.
35%, just China.
Wow.
And the latest numbers, 23, early 24, they show this gap widening.
Starkly. China's emissions jumped about 4% in 2023, maybe up another 0.5% or so projected for 2024. India's growth was even stronger, over 8% in 2023, still growing fast in 24.
8%, while the US and EU were dropping like 3% and 7.5% respectively in 23.
Exactly. The contrast is sharp, and the drivers in Asia. Mainly continued reliance on coal, and just huge growth in energy demand overall as their economies expand rapidly.
Okay, let's break down those numbers a bit more. China, total emissions around, what, 11.9 gigatons of co-euros?
Roughly, yeah. About 35% of the world's total. Their official targets are ambitious on paper. Peak emissions around 2030, carbon neutrality by 2060.
And they are installing a ton of renewables, right? I saw numbers like 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar by mid-2024.
It's absolutely massive. Truly enormous investment in renewables, like adding capacity equivalent to the entire existing U.S. wind and solar fleet in just a couple of years.
Okay, BUT, and this feels like the crucial but. They're still super reliant on coal. Record production in 2023. Still building dozens of new coal plants.
That is the central paradox. World leader in deploying renewables, simultaneously digging more coal and building more coal power plants. They had something like 95 gigaW of new coal under construction in early 2024.
It seems contradictory. What about India? Smaller share globally, maybe 7 or 8%?
Around that, yeah. Somewhere between 2.6 and 2.8 gigatons. Their net zero target is further out, 2070. Rapid GDP growth is just pushing energy demand through the roof.
But they're also investing in renewables.
They are, significantly. Added about 35 gigaW of solar and wind in 2024. Huge investment figures in 23. Non-fossil sources are actually around 46% of their total installed capacity now.
Nearly half.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
But the coal factor again.
Still a dominant factor. Coal use is rising. Record production, record imports in early 2024. It still provides over half, maybe closer to 60% of their actual electricity generation.
So similar story. Renewables growing fast, but coal isn't shrinking. It might even be growing too.
That's the dynamic. And when you look at independent policy ratings, like from Climate Action Tracker, it's not great news.
What do they say? China's current policies are rated insufficient, meaning not aligned with keeping warming below even 2 degrees, let alone 1.5.
Okay.
And India, rated even worse,
Yeah.
highly insufficient.
Oof. So the policies aren't matching the scale of the challenge, basically.
Not according to these analyses. Now, both countries have justifications. China talks energy security. India talks poverty alleviation, needing affordable energy for development.
Understandable pressures.
Absolutely. But the outcome is continued heavy fossil fuel use. And it's worth noting, China's own interim targets, like for co-Euros intensity reduction by 2025, seem to be off track.
Right. So let's pull back to the big picture. What does all this mean for global climate efforts? If the West makes these cuts, faces the backlash,
But emissions from the biggest players keep rising strongly.
does it just get canceled out globally?
That's the fundamental challenge, yes. Global warming is about the cumulative total of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So even if the US and EU make deep cuts, if that's offset by growth elsewhere, the global total keeps climbing.
So the temperature targets, they become harder to reach.
Much harder. Some analysis warns that if every country followed China's current trajectory, we'd be heading for warming well over 2 degrees Celsius, maybe closer to 3 degrees.
3 degrees. And the recent data confirms it, right? China and India were the biggest contributors to global emissions growth in 23-24.
They were, yeah, effectively counteracting a lot of the reductions achieved elsewhere, particularly in Europe.
Which throws that whole climate equity issue into really sharp relief, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You have the historical responsibility argument developed countries emitted most in the past.
Versus the current reality, where developing Asia, led by China, is the biggest emitter now, even though India's per-person emissions are still low.
Exactly. India's per capita is only about 2 tons a year, roughly half the global average. China's is much higher now, of course, but still lower than the U.S. This feeds into that core principle in climate talks: common but differentiated responsibilities.
Meaning developing nations argue the richer countries should lead the cuts and help pay for the transition elsewhere.
That's the argument. Provide finance, provide technology transfer, help them leapfrog the dirtiest development stages.
And we saw this tension play out at COP28, right? With that big agreement to transition away from fossil fuels, a first time for that language.
It was a landmark moment, yes. But significantly, it was framed as needing to be a swift, just, and equitable transition, and crucially linked to scaled-up finance.
So the language acknowledged the needs of developing countries. China and India essentially got recognition that they need help.
They secured that linkage, yes. While China did sign on to the overall goal of transitioning away, it reflects the compromise.
Okay, so we're left with this really tricky situation. The West is facing serious social and economic stress from trying to decarbonize.
Real costs, real anxieties.
While at the same time, emissions are still climbing significantly in the economies that matter most for the global total, China and India.
It's an incredibly delicate global balancing act, and the bottom line, based on current climate science, seems clear. Global temperature goals, 1.5 degrees, even 2 degrees likely, cannot be met just by cuts in the West, however deep they are.
Not without significant rapid action from China and India as well.
Absolutely crucial, which points towards needing much stronger international cooperation, finding ways to balance ambitious commitments from all the major emitters.
While also providing real substantial support money, tech, help with managing the social impacts, that just transition idea for developing nations.
Exactly, to ensure it's equitable, to make it politically possible everywhere, and just to accelerate the global shift. The whole COP process really embodies that tension, pushing for faster fossil fuel phase-out.
But constantly grappling with how to do it fairly, acknowledging different starting points and needs.
Yeah, that's the crux of it.
So bringing it all together, we've really dug into this core challenge today. On one side, the real difficulties, the social costs of climate action hitting home in Western countries. You know, like those Europeans worried about buying power.
Tangible impacts.
And on the other side, the sheer scale of ongoing emissions growth in major developing economies, particularly China and India, despite their renewables push.
Offsetting many of the gains elsewhere.
It really forces you to step back and think, okay, given all this, what are the most effective ways forward? And maybe more importantly, what are the most equitable ways forward for global climate action?
Yeah, how do you square that circle?
Especially with such different economic realities, different historical contributions, what can actually work on a global scale? It's certainly a lot to think about.
Definitely leaves you with some big questions.
It does. Well, thanks for taking the deep dive with us today.